The other big trend for the next 25 years is the energy transition. The race by all countries around the world to rebuild their networks, their transport systems, their industrial bases. The cost is in the many trillions of dollars, and the speed of the transformation will shape the competitiveness of nations for generations to come. This week, a new book called Climate Capitalism, Winning the Global Race to Zero Emissions, was released by Bloomberg senior reporter Akshat Rathi. I spoke with him this week from London and started with the expectation of big profits on those huge investments being made.
I think now is the era where we have entered a world where it is clear that we have to do something about climate change, but that it's not philanthropy. It is not trying to just spend money without any returns. But the only way we are going to be able to solve this problem is if we invest into solutions with a hope for return and thus scale those solutions to a level where they make a meaningful difference. And what I show in the book is that actually happening in many parts of the world, in many different sectors. You can very well argue not enough and not fast enough and not all the places in the world, but it is happening in many places at very large scales. We are talking hundreds of billions of dollars being spent by large economies on an annual basis.
And even if you look at, say, the Inflation Reduction Act in America, which is really subsidising the electrification of America, I mean, this is quite astonishing. The government's spending hundreds of billions of dollars to kickstart the energy transformation.
Yes, the Inflation Reduction Act is one big bet, and that is sort of the hundreds of billions of dollars bet. And it is very much, as you summarize it, driven by subsidies, where governments want to incentivize private industry to spend money in the sectors where they think first emissions will be reduced, but also simultaneously where they will build industrial competitiveness to other economies. They want to build electric cars and batteries in the US so that they don't have to depend on Chinese supply. They want to make solar panels in the US so they don't have to depend on Chinese supply. And so that is very much one form of climate capitalism, but it's not the only form. The European Union is doing a mix of things. It's providing subsidies, but it has also got a pretty strong carbon price, which is going to drive people to lower their emissions because otherwise it is expensive to pollute. And of course, there's the Chinese capitalism, where it is very much driven by the state. It's not quite transparent. It's not as transparent as we have in the case of the US. And there are all kinds of subsidies that are indirect.
Do developing countries have an advantage because they have to invest in infrastructure anyway?
That is certainly correct. And it's already starting to happen in some places. So I grew up in India, and one thing I can tell you is that we went from landline to mobile phones very, very quickly. And those are the very few people who had there were very few people who had landline, and many people now have mobile phones. So a lot of people never actually had a landline. And that's sort of starting to happen with energy too, because especially developing countries, most of them which are within the sort of tropics, have a lot of solar resources. And solar is cheap, and so they can leapfrog to getting energy access for the very first time that is just clean from the get-go. But we should be careful that that is not a solution that will work out on its own, because even as that's an attractive option, and even as solar is now the cheapest form of energy, there isn't always capital available to be able to make those purchases in developing countries. So currently, the world needs about $4.5 trillion to be able to reach net zero on an annual basis. $1 trillion needs to be spent in developed countries. $3 trillion needs to be spent in developing countries. The $1 trillion is coming in developed countries. That money is kind of there, not being spent in the right way, not with the right policies, but the capital is there.
Everybody in the Western world, say, looks at Elon Musk and Tesla and says this is the height of innovation, that the height of changing an industry so rapidly in terms of Tesla becoming the most valuable car company in the world. But you actually tell the story of the Chinese entrepreneur and minister Wang Gang, who really through his own determination and scientific background created an even bigger industry than what Elon Musk has done.
Certainly. Wang Yang doesn't have a social media platform, so you probably don't hear about him as much, and he doesn't want to shout out about all the achievements he's made. But his impact on the transition to electric cars is bigger than Elon Musk's. And the numbers speak for itself. In the period that he was the Chinese science minister, this is around 2007 to 2018, he got the Chinese state to spend $60 billion from the coffers on all kinds of initiatives. And it's a conservative estimate. That $60 billion was then matched by private industry, sometimes 5 times the amount or 10 times the amount, to be able to build hundreds of electric car companies and battery companies that supported the ecosystem. And those numbers are now starting to have real impact, both in China, which is selling something like 7 million electric vehicles annually today, and is exporting many of those vehicles to the extent where the Europeans are worried, just like we had cheap solar panels from China flooding our market, will we now have cheap Chinese EVs flooding our market, and what will that do to our own auto industry?
It's been said to me that the real value, say in a company like Tesla or in the Chinese car companies, is not the selling of the vehicles, but actually in the energy that's stored cumulatively in the batteries. And as soon as you start to network them, just explain that to me.
That is one potential. I wouldn't say that electric cars' value is just the energy stored in its batteries. It is certainly a car, and the most use it's going to have is to move around. But it is an asset which, if you imagine, let's even forget electric cars, most of the time our gasoline cars are sitting in the driveway. 95% of the time, they are stationary. Electric cars are going to be the same, except you can actually put the electric car to a use if the market allowed you to do it, because it is a big battery. Many of the cars can actually power a household for a day, 2 days. Sometimes if you're running a pickup truck, an electric pickup truck, the American size, for 5 days, you could power an entire house with the electric car battery.
Akshat Rathi, author of Climate Capitalism, Winning the Global Race to Zero Emissions. It's great to chat to you. Many thanks for your time today.